Okay.
Not more, kind of real thin, so,
Okay, we're live if you want to come over here.
okay. And they also, by the way, have great peppers at that.
Okay.
Good too.
We should have a good Wi-Fi signal today.
Yeah, they worked.
Good stuff.
Do I need to text somebody to send out a reminder, Hannah, or like a? Oh, shoot, yeah, that's good.
You want to put a bag in this one or not? Chris?
What?
Did you get the email on the new camera for the proposed camera system? Tam?
Oh, yeah, for that.
Did you get my email?
Yes, I sent you one back.
Oh, did you?
I think I did. That's.
Are you talking? Your mic is off. Click on. Okay. I'm clicking on my mic on. Now I can hear it all over the place, don't I?
Okay, that's my problem. What do I do?
Turn hers on.
You have to be,
I am.
unless you have your phone on.
What it is.
Well, I'm hearing myself in Tana's computer again.
So let me just turn. Because I'm all right.
You're. Yeah, you're muted. She's muted.
Well, now.
Investors hearing voices. These happen to be at home.
Hearing. There's a voice in my head that just comes out of my head. Well, this time I only have 5 logged on, not the traditional 20 to 21 or 2.
Yvonne and text asked her she would send that big thread. I can't, because my carrier won't let me.
Okay, well. Yes, I plan on.
Okay, she says it's done.
Okay. Oh. Yes. We'll have 4 people on.
And I want to.
And for those who are concerned, there, I need a better strap so my ears don't flop out, but there we go. There, I'm ready now. No, I'm not.
Are you afraid your computer's got a virus?
Send her tomorrow.
I'm not gonna wear it, but
Your ears stick out.
I know I need to have, I don't wanna look like Dumbo.
You know, your nose isn't long enough.
There. So I got that in case anyone's interested. But I will not wear this tomorrow because, well, just because I think people will laugh more than we need to be serious when you're in church. But I got it. Okay, it's 9:58 in some seconds. Don't know how many. We're up to 6 people, devices, I mean.
I've been 7. I stayed home.
Oh, yeah, we have 1 here, so that would be 7. Since one attendee is here, physically present.
That might be as far as you need to go.
We won't say anymore, that's right.
Did the cable get put in?
You got Wi-Fi?
Yeah, we're up and running strong now, the Wi-Fi.
They came back already?
Oh, yeah.
They came back. We ran the cable Wednesday. I did, and then they came in Wednesday or
Thursday morning.
And took it up.
Wow.
Yeah.
They had one.
They came by when right when I was coming in, they were here, and then I opened the door for them.
Yeah, we ran it into the closet, and then they got up in the attic, and got the attic down. Different behind the TV.
Well, good.
Okay. 7 are on. Now we're getting up there.
I might have forgotten too, because, we never do this on Saturday.
Well, I know, except on the Easter weekend is the only time we did it Saturday. So we have to start getting used to doing this on Saturday. And not everyone can because they have other commitments probably on Saturday. Whereas Sunday's kind of obviously set
They
aside.
can turn the car drive, and they can have the phone on.
Right. Well,
Well, this is on YouTube, right? So
yeah, it's over here on
they-
YouTube here, Google Meets here, I guess. Let me just, it is 10 o'clock, so let me start talking at least. We are going to be in 1 Corinthians 7. Of course, tomorrow we have church at both places, 8 o'clock in Houston, 10:45 here in Salem. If you are not able or willing or ready yet to come to church, it will still be broadcast on Facebook Live, right, and YouTube, right? Okay, at 10:45. This is the Bible class, so we won't have a Bible class at 9:30. We have our own Bible class on the book of Acts. We'll be going back to that. So those who are doing this, you'll get double Bible classes if you want to come to Bible class tomorrow. And in our church here in Salem with the Bible class, the fellowship hall here is so large, we're going to spread everything out so we can still practice social distancing and still have Bible class. We don't have a lot of people so that we can still do this and not have a problem with people sitting too close to each other. And tomorrow for our Bible class here in Salem, it's be Acts chapter 10. That's where we left off. And in Houston, we'll go back to our Thursday evening Bible class because we don't have a whole lot of people in that one either. And we can spread out if we need to in the fellowship hall there. And we're in Acts chapter 5, I think, there, or 6, something like that. I'm not sure. But right now we're on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So let's go ahead and get into this study. This is a very, very long chapter. It's 40 verses long, which makes it very hard to get done in an hour, although it may not be actually. The topic is actually pretty much one subject, but there's an underlying theme going along with the one subject. The one subject actually is marriage, but it's not the duties of marriage, husband and wife in marriage, and it's not just marriage. It also pertains to singleness or marital bliss. This is one of those that would actually kind of be a little bit more awkward to discuss because it is such a personal one, and it's not dealing with the duties of a husband and wife in marriage. That one is actually in Ephesians chapter 5 that Paul writes. This one actually has to do with sex in marriage. Is what this one's really pertaining to, but not the entire subject by any means, or chapter by any means. And so this is kind of a marriage seminar in that respect. But it's not exclusively a marriage seminar because it also does pertain to single people as well, and even includes widows and widowers also, which would be single, I know, but they had been married before. I said that it's a long chapter. It has 10 topics under the subject of marriage. There's one topic in here that will not really strictly be marriage. It will be, actually even talks about being a slave. And when we get to that one, you'll understand that there is this underlying theme that is carried throughout 1 Corinthians 7. And the underlying theme is the present crisis Paul will talk about. When we get to that, you'll understand that the present crisis may likely pertain to two aspects. And you'll hear what that is as we get to that. But I will say that one aspect of the present crisis is called eschatology or end times. So as Paul talks about this subject of marriage, he also talks about it in the context of the end times and the fact that we are getting closer to the return of Christ. Now, why is Paul referring to this subject at this point? Is because Paul actually says at the very beginning, he says, now about the matters you wrote about. And what we're getting at here is that this is clearly a different subject. but it has a connection to the previous subjects. We've been saying in the past that you always need to read the letter as a letter and not just as a theological textbook that have chapters on this and this and this, but you have to catch the flow as it goes through the letter. And Paul has been addressing issues that he had heard about that were problems going on in Corinth. And to go way back to, it says, I heard from Chloe's household about problems, basically divisions going on and quarrels among the people. But he's heard more. And as he's heard more, how he's heard that more is because three men, and you'll hear their names at the end of the letter, but I'll mention them to you now. If you have the notes, it's in the second line of the notes. Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. Those were the three men, and Paul actually already mentioned Stephanas. He said he baptized the household of Stephanas. But those were the three men that apparently had come from Corinth, from the church in Corinth, to Paul. And when they came to Paul, they reported what was going on in Corinth. And it also seems like more than just reporting, they also either brought a letter or brought comments, but most likely was a letter, from the Corinthian congregation to Paul, in which they asked Paul questions about matters that they were concerned about. And so he starts this by saying, now about the matters you wrote about. So I guess it was a letter, it wasn't just comments that they had those three men express. So apparently they had a letter that they gave to Paul, and Paul read this letter, and in this letter they asked about certain matters. One of the matters they asked about is this chapter. And it seems like they asked about more than just this matter, and you're going to get that in other chapters. So why does Paul address this one first? And it could be for various reasons. Obviously, it could be the very first question they asked, but it could also likely be that this comes right out of the flow of what Paul has been talking about. And in the flow of chapters 5 and 6, chapter 5, we had the case of the immoral man who had his father's wife, which would be a stepmother. So you had the case of there. Then in chapter 6, you had not the lawsuit aspect we're talking about now, but the aspect about being united to a prostitute, okay, or sexual immorality that Paul was talking about there. And so you had this theme that's been going through, which is kind of a sad thing to be discussing in church, that they had sexual immorality going in this congregation, and that they were actually even proud of it, not ashamed. They weren't repentant about it. And they weren't even acknowledging them that it was wrong. And so Paul now is saying, he had said in chapters 5 and 6 how those things were wrong and needed to be dealt with. So in chapter 7, it will make sense then that now he says this is how it's properly to be done. This is what proper sexual morality, I guess you would say it that way, actually is. So that's what chapter 7 is really about. And if we're talking about proper sexual activity, that has to be within the state of marriage, properly understood. So that's why Paul's talking about marriage. And in this case, he's talking about sexual activity within marriage. Again, he's not talking about the role of husband and wife in marriage. If you have the notes, you'll also note that it says in our notes that this chapter, there's 3 translation issues in this chapter. You'll see that they're kind of highlighted in the footnotes if you have a Concordia Self-Study Bible. And the 3 translation matters are kind of interesting, actually. They don't make a big change in discussion, but they are interesting. So what the first one is in verse 1. It says, or is it in verse 2? I mean, verse 2. Where does it go? It's in the verse 1. It says, it is good for a man not to marry. That's what the NIV says. But probably a better translation is, as it says in the footnote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Or in this case, meaning that he should avoid sexual relations with a woman altogether. And now this becomes an interesting topic here. And what makes it interesting is that it seems like what's happening is Paul is quoting some in the congregation because they asked about this matter. And so he's quoting some in the congregation who actually seems to were exalting celibacy, exalting it over marriage itself. And this, by the way, this is really an interesting subject. This whole chapter has some intriguing points to it. And part of that is what I think is intriguing is because when you think about Paul himself personally, you think about him espousing, or you may think about him espousing celibacy and even praising it over marriage. But he doesn't do that. The Roman Catholics will tend to highlight Paul's statements about celibacy as they support, of course, the celibacy of the priesthood and the nuns and monks. You get this impression that Paul is actually a proponent of celibacy over marriage. And you also get a impression, or some people have an impression of Paul that he's a misogynist. That means he doesn't like women. And that's not true either. And you're going to find out how wrong or how unfair those two comments are to Paul as we go through this. Paul is not saying either of those things. All right, so this comment about the proper translation probably would say it is good for a man not to touch a woman. And that term touch a woman means to have sexual relations with a woman. And that Paul's already talking about, he's not talking about sexual immorality. He's even saying that there are those within the church who are saying even in the marriage bond that there should be celibacy. And honestly, when you trace church history, it wasn't long after this, in a few hundred years or so after this, that there were those who actually proposed that, wrongly so. They meant well, but they were wrong in doing so. There were the ascetics who were actually married, husband and wife that were married, but never had sexual relations with each other. They considered that a bad, evil thing. And that seems to be what's going on here, that Paul's saying there are those in your congregation that are think they're so spiritual that anything physical activity is evil. And that was kind of a Greek philosophy regarding things. Some had that approach. Some had the approach, anything physical is evil. Some had physical is nothing. You can do whatever you want and just indulge in it all you want. But so now he's addressing those who thought any physical activities were evil. And so what ended up happening in Christianity, there were those, they were called the ascetics, ASCETICS, and they would basically withdraw from society altogether. And this is where the monasteries ended up developing from this. But they would completely withdraw from society. They would eat only what was absolutely necessary to survive because they thought it was anything material is evil. Some of them were so repulsed by their bodies. This is kind of awkward to talk about. They were so repulsed by the bodies that they never ever bathed because they didn't want to see their own naked body. So they never ever bathed. So you see why they lived by themselves. No one would ever want to be with them. They were so disgusted by their own body that they wouldn't even look at their own body. All right. And so there were those who actually had gotten married, but then they decided they needed to live the ascetic life as husband and wife. So Paul seems to be addressing that, where he says that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and he's answering that point. And so how does he answer that point? He says just the obvious in verse 2, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each wife should have her own husband, and they should fulfill their marital duties to each other. He says, not everyone, and he's going to say at the end of this section, says not everyone's gifted. And this is the point to understand. It's a gift. And it's not something that, I guess some people can strive to be celibate, but it's really a gift from God. That's what Paul is saying. He says, if you're not gifted that way, then don't insist upon it, like the Roman Catholics have done with the priests and the nuns. He says it's a gift from God. Celibacy was never actually praised in Scripture. It was never praised in the Old Testament. God at the very beginning, he says it's not good for the man to be alone, so he made a helper suitable for him. God himself instituted marriage. God ordained marriage. God encourages marriage. God never really said, I want you to be celibate all your life and not ever get married. That was not something that was praised or practiced in the Old Testament by the Jews. Now, it does become a thing among Christians later on because they misinterpret what Paul's saying here, but it was never something that God encouraged. Now, Paul does clearly say, though, that God has gifted some people with the ability to be celibate, but basically speaking, he says he in creating people, he created people with a sex drive. And that sex drive is there by God's creation, but it's also to be nurtured only within the state of marriage and not outside of marriage. So that's what he's talking about here in this first section. He says that within the state of marriage, yes, you are to engage in the sexual activity, but only within the state of marriage, and you're not to deprive your spouse of that, is what he's saying. This is why this gets kind of one of those that if we weren't among Christians, people would get kind of goofy about this and make crude, coarse jokes about this. But Paul is speaking from God's perspective. This is the very word of God. He says you don't deprive, husband and wife don't deprive each other. You know how they do it in TV shows where the wife's going to punish her husband, so she's going to deprive him of sexual activity. And Paul is basically saying that's wrong. That's a sin. You don't do that. Your body doesn't belong to you, but to your spouse, and your spouse's body belongs to you as well. Now, that is obviously not to be meant in an abusive sort of fashion either, because understand, Paul is talking to Christians whose desires to love their spouse. And so the activity then is to be done in that manner. He says, he's acknowledging again, because there's so much immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman should have her own husband. They should fulfill their marital duties to each other. They don't, verse 5, don't deprive each other, and that just means of sexual activity, except by mutual consent. And even then only for a time, Paul says, not like the ascetics would later do and do that for the rest of their lives. He says, do it for a time, and if you do it for a time, you agree to do that, but you're doing it for spiritual reasons. You're doing it so you can devote yourselves to prayer, Paul says, which would, probably include more than just prayer, but the spiritual devotion, meditation upon God's word. He says, but then come back together again because Satan will tempt you otherwise, and you don't want that. So that's the first section that he's talking about. He does say, though, he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. And the concession part is what he's saying there is the concession is about the depriving each other. He says, I'm not commanding you to deprive each other of sexual activity. He says, if that's what you agree to do as a couple, then go ahead and do that. It's totally up to you. And then he says, I wish that all men would be anybody, men or women, generic in that term. I wish that all men were as I am, but each has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. And so Paul is saying for himself, he says, Paul is talking about him. He's celibate at this point. He's saying, and so, and he's totally okay with that. He will have a comment later about this in chapter 9 about the fact that if he wanted to, he should be able to take along with him a believing wife. So it's not saying that he is praising celibacy over marriage. And you'll see how this carries out as this chapter still goes. So let me move on to because we're taking a lot of time on just one section. There's 10 sections to it. So now we get to verse 8. And verse 8 is really kind of an interesting verse here because it poses another translation problem, which is really easily solved in this one. In the NIV and also the ESV, it says, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say. All right. Now, the translation problem is not that the word is mistranslated. It's not mistranslated. It's just misunderstood. When he says to the unmarried and the widows. All right. Now, what does he mean by the unmarried? The word literally is unmarried, but in all probability, from what Martin Luther in his commentary or translation, and then what our Lutheran here commentator is saying, is that he's probably talking about widowers. because he says to the unmarried and the widows. Why would he lump unmarried with widows when it would make more sense, since he just talked about a husband and a wife? Now it would make more sense if he's going to talk about a widow, he talked about a widower. So the unmarried is probably referring to widowers. And the reason why he doesn't say to the widowers is because apparently there was no word in the language for widower. It wasn't usually women outlive men, but also they didn't have a term for widower because the term widow was more than just a state. It was also a social status or standing, which was one of often, sadly, poverty. Widowers, see, widows, what made their life so hard is that they were generally supported by their husbands, but if their husbands died, then they're in a destitute state. Widowers aren't supported by their wives financially, so if their wives died, they're just unmarried. So they didn't have a term for widower. So it seems like Paul really here is talking about the term, or talking about widowers. So to the widowers and the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. All right, now, this, by the way, points out one other interesting aspect. And this might take a little while to say, but it's more historical and personal to Paul than anything else. I remember hearing a long time ago on the radio how someone was saying that Paul probably was married. And I thought, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Of course, Paul wasn't married because he always says that to remain unmarried as I am, or to be in this state as I am. But then actually, I think the guy probably knew more than I realized at the time. And actually reading this, the commentator on this, it all makes sense to me. I never really studied it before. Paul probably had been married. And the reason why, two reasons at least, why that is probably what it was, is that because Paul was a Jew. And like I said, in the Old Testament, celibacy was not encouraged. It was not praised. Jews were encouraged to get married. And until Paul was converted, he was really under an Old Testament system. And so he most likely had been married. And that's one reason, because Jews would have always got married if they could. The other reason that they say that Paul was probably married is because he was a rabbi or a Pharisee and a Pharisee. And according to Jewish law, the Jewish rabbi or the rabbis were married. They were not to be single. They were to be married because they were to set the example to the other Jewish homes of what a proper. Now Jesus never got married, of course, but what a proper rabbi or Pharisee would do. And the priest. Now Paul wasn't a priest because he wasn't from the tribe of Levi or the family of Aaron, but they were all to be married. And then they would have widowed on occasion, and so either Paul was widowed, by the way. So that's the suggestion. And again, it's not a serious matter because it's just a historical thing. It's not a doctrinal thing. But Paul most likely had been married, and either he was widowed or his wife divorced him. And if that were the case, he wouldn't have divorced her. But if his wife divorced him, it may have happened after his conversion, and she just would not go along with what he was now into as a Christian. Those are just pious suggestions. But the way Paul is phrasing this, where he says, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am, by saying unmarried as I am, it seems like he's saying that, see, I had been married, because he's talking about widowers and widows now. He's saying I had been married, and now I'm unmarried because of my state, and just like you are. And so for you who are widows or widowers, it'd be good for you to stay this way. But it's just two little verses. This is the famous line, it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Because if you burn with passion, you're probably going to, so if you're a widow or widower and you just can't control your sexual drive, and then your temptation is to engage in sexual immorality, then he's saying you need to get married, because it's better to do that than to burn with the passion. Because if you burn with the passion and you keep acting on that passion, then most likely you'll burn in hell. So you need to deal with this. And so if you can't control yourself, then get married, is what he's saying. And he'll address that at the very end of the chapter again, once more, in regard to widows. Yeah, question.
When people divorce, were they considered, they couldn't, once they divorced, they couldn't get married because it would be considered adultery?
Well, that's going to come up in the very next one.
Okay.
Not the very next one. It's going to come up. There's 10 topics. And it's, again, he covers basically every aspect that you can think of from Christian point of view on marriage. Okay? So we're going to get to that. What about divorcees or whatever how you use the term? All right, but we're not to that one yet. So to the next section, verse 10 through 11, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband must not divorce his wife. All right, now here's the one. Now this is going to be the one that's going to be a touchy one, because I'm just going to say it. I'm not passing judgment on absolutely anybody at all, but divorce is a very common thing even in the Christian church. It was never ever approved, sanctioned, or condoned by God. Again, I'm just saying it the way it is right here. This is what he's saying. He says you are to remain married, and if you get divorced, you stay unmarried. You don't remarry unless you remarry your own spouse again. That's what he's saying here. And I know this not happening very often in Christianity. I'm just saying we're just doing it the text. Okay, I'm just saying what the text is, and this is what Paul is saying. Of course, marriage in the Old Testament, there's a passage in Malachi. Yeah, Malachi somewhere, I forgot where it was, where God just says, I hate divorce. That's just what he says, I hate divorce. And he always has. And when Jesus was asked about the question, he does not give any exceptions except for marital unfaithfulness. And basically, it's the one in Matthew 19. And then there's a couple others like abuse, we would say, or abandonment, we would say, for divorce. But otherwise, the command is you don't get divorced. And it's interesting here, though. This is the passage also where you can say that Paul is by no means a misogynist who hates women, because he says a wife must not separate from her husband. That's actually an intriguing thing to say, because generally in that culture, it was the husbands who would divorce the wives, not the wives divorce the husbands. I mean, the equality wasn't as strong then as it is now. And yet Paul actually says wives don't separate from your husbands. When Jesus was asked the question was phrased to him, can a husband divorce his wife for any reason? So Jesus dealt with it as a husband divorcing his wife. So Paul is actually honoring wives and women and putting them on the same plane with men. He's not a misogynist. He's saying, wives, you need to be just like this too. You need to treat your husbands like husbands are supposed to treat their wives, and don't divorce them. That's what he's saying here. So it's kind of an interesting thing that he's saying, misogyny. He's not a misogynist. He doesn't believe in that at all. But so he does say that. And now when it says that, it says to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Now that's going to be an interesting point, because later he's going to, the next time say, I, not the Lord. All right. So what's going on here with this I, not the Lord, or not I, but the Lord? And what's happening here is most likely Paul is simply quoting, when he says not I, but the Lord, he's quoting the Lord. And he's quoting what Jesus himself said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He doesn't say it in John. But when he's asked, can a man divorce his wife, a husband divorce his wife, Jesus was asked that. So Jesus gave a very clear statement, or a very clear answer regarding divorce. And so basically, without quoting verbatim what Jesus said, Paul's saying, this isn't coming from me alone. This comes from the Lord Jesus. So, and whenever he says Lord, it's referring to Jesus. So he said, Jesus himself was asked this question. So this is what Jesus said: don't divorce. Right? So that's what he's saying there in that little section. All right. So that is interesting there. Now, it is interesting also, too, because back in verse 6, he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. Whereas in verse 10, he says, to the married, I give this command. So he actually says this is a command. This isn't just a, you can do what you want about this. This is actually a command of what he's saying here. All right. So, and again, I know that is an issue in modern society today, the matter of divorce. He's not really dealing with divorce as a whole issue. He's just saying this is the way it is. You shouldn't divorce. Okay, so that's one, because that's, again, we're covering the topic of marriage. This is one of the subjects. So he's talking about husband and wife, about their marital activity. Then he talks about widowers and widows. And now he's talking about husbands and wives in respect to should they get divorced or can they or not. He says no. So then in verse 12, he says, to the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord. Okay, so now in verse 12 says, I say this, not the Lord. So this is one of those where those who are opponents of Christianity and don't believe so much in the inerrancy and the authority of Scripture who say, oh, Paul's just giving a personal opinion here. And so if it's just his personal opinion, it doesn't, we don't have to accept it. It's not that important. It's more of advice. It's not a command. But that's not really what he's saying. He says, when he says, I, not the Lord, it's really what he's simply saying. He says, I don't have a specific statement from the Lord in this matter like I did in the previous matter. In the previous matter about divorce, he says, Jesus was specifically asked that question. In this matter, there is no account in the earthly ministry of Jesus where he was actually asked about this. So Paul's saying, so I will tell you what I am saying from the Lord. Now and this is still just as valid as if the Lord himself were speaking, because Paul is speaking as the inspired apostle of the Lord. He's just saying, I'm not quoting a specific passage, but I am telling you what the Holy Spirit wants you to know, and this is what it is. So what he's talking about here is a different subject now, and the subject he's talking about now is a mixed marriage, is how we would call it. And this makes sense that there's no statement from Jesus, because Jesus was a Jew living among Jews, and Jews were already strictly forbidden to practice mixed marriages. By mixed marriage, we mean a Jew was commanded, you do not marry outside the Jewish faith and the Jewish race. Now, people did do that on occasion, but it was very rarely done. So there wasn't really such a thing as a predominant matter of a Jew marrying a Greek. Now, I know it happened. Again, I know it happened. But in Israel, in the time of Jesus' ministry, it's basically Jews marrying Jews. So there's no such thing as a mixed marriage. So in this case, what we mean by mixed marriage, we mean now, we'll just say this way, not for a Jew and a Gentile. Now we're talking about a Christian and a non-Christian. Now, Paul is going to eventually kind of say, he says, I don't think you should marry, if you are a Christian, you shouldn't marry a non-Christian. So he's really not talking about that. That'll come at the very end of this, by the way. He's really talking about what would have happened frequently in that culture. Before Paul and the apostles started their missionary journey, all those people were pagans. So as they started doing their missionary work, people are getting converted. But it doesn't mean that both husband and wife were always converted. Sometimes only the husband or sometimes only the wife was converted. And the other one remained a pagan. And that's what Paul's talking about here about mixed marriages. He's saying he says, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And then he says the same about if a woman has a husband who's willing to live and he's not a believer and he's willing to stay in the marriage, she must not divorce him. Now, why would he even say they must not divorce? And probably what's going on here is that the suggestion is that some of these Christians may have got a misimpression of what Paul said back in chapter 5. Where it says about don't associate with the sexually immoral. that are he says not at all, meaning those in this world, but those who are brothers and who call themselves brothers but are sexually immoral. But he thinks, or it seems like some of the Christians thought, oh no, my spouse isn't a believer. Am I being defiled by remaining with my spouse? Because I'm a Christian, I'm a holy person, not a self-righteous holier than thou, but I'm a holier person. My spouse is not. So should I divorce my spouse because that would be the right thing to do? That was really just a legitimate question. That was seemed to be what was they were wondering. Should Paul tell us, what should we divorce our spouses because we want to stay holy and withdraw from those who are unholy? And Paul's point is, no, you don't. If your spouse is not a Christian and your spouse is willing to remain with you, then you do not divorce your spouse. You stay with your spouse. And what he's getting at here, because then he talks about this thing about the believing, for the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and unbelieving wife sanctified through her believing husband, and about the children also. And this is really an intriguing section because it can be taken out of proportion and thus misunderstood. No one can believe for someone else. You can't get someone else into heaven because of your faith. And so Paul is not saying that if you are the Christian in the home, that automatically all the others who aren't Christians become saved because they're kind of holding on to your coattails as you go to heaven, even though they don't believe. He's not saying that at all. What he's really getting at is that still this understanding that if I'm the Christian married to a non-Christian, will that non-Christian's defilement and uncleanness somehow make me impure and make me defiled or unsanctified in that case? And Paul's saying, no, that's not how it works. And in reality, what he's saying is you need to be greater and stronger in your faith and in your Christian lifestyle, your sanctified life, than the unbeliever does. And this really needs to be encouraged because sadly nowadays, it's not really how it's happening. This is why oftentimes when people are thinking about getting married, Christians and pastors will encourage their members, marry a Christian, don't marry a non-Christian, thinking that you'll change that non-Christian to a Christian. Because sadly, too often what happens nowadays is that the faith of the Christian isn't strong enough to overcome the unbelieving nature of the non-Christian. And so what sadly happens, we've seen this several times too in our churches, where the believer marries an unbeliever who may not claim to be an unbeliever, but obviously isn't practicing a faith anyway because they never go to church. And then what ends up happening is the believer starts to drift away. And the believer ends up quitting church also. Because they say, I want to keep peace in my home, and the more I keep insisting on going to church and all that, it causes troubles in the house and all that. So I'll just not worry about it anymore. Or I want to be with my family on the weekends, and so they just drift away. Yeah, I got a question? Go ahead.
So does he say something about the non-believer and the believer getting married first? So he's talking about after the marriage.
Yeah, he's not really, okay. The question was, is he talking about a believer intentionally marrying an unbeliever, right? Yeah. And he's going to say at the very, very end, look at the very last verse, or second last verse. He's basically, and he's talking about a widow there, but he's saying, he doesn't recommend that at all. Now in 2 Corinthians, it talks about being yoked together, believer and unbeliever. He's not necessarily talking about marriage, although that passage in 2 Corinthians 6 is often used to refer to marriage. And it may, but I don't think it technically is. But he's saying, just basically, as you're going to find out later, I'm still not even halfway through there. But as you find, he's basically saying, because of the problems in this world, why do you want to put yourself through that? Is what he's getting at. There are so many problems in this world. Why add to the problems that you're going to have as a Christian, particularly in that society? So I'm kind of rambling around now. Why would you want to add to your problems? And the problems are, you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be harassed as a Christian. So why do you want to be married to someone who's going to do that to you? So why would you enter into and intentionally enter into a relationship where that's possibly going to happen? Why would you think that would be a good way to do it? All right, and that's kind of a way of putting it. Now, so again, he's talking about that. He's talking about at one point, neither of you are Christians, but one became a Christian. So now you need to stay in that marriage, and you need to do all you can, not to have that person influence you, but you influence the unbelieving spouse and even your children. And so you raise your children as best you can in the Lord, even if your spouse doesn't do that. You do what you can to do that. And you have to understand that in that society, what Paul's saying was pretty rough. Generally speaking, like still is today, there are more female believers than there were male believers. And so wives converted to Christianity more often than husbands. And in that society, the wife was basically the servant of the husband. So if the wife converted to Christianity and her husband didn't, she's still expected to do what her husband asked her to do. And what you have to understand is that if her husband was a businessman and he went to a pagan business meeting at a pagan temple, she was expected to go with him and participate in that. And she had done that before. So you see now how hard this would be for the Christian wife would be like, now what does she do? Does she resist her husband and do what's right in God's eyes and not her and thus disobey her husband, which is what she's supposed to do, and she knows that. But if she does that, she knows what's going to happen. She's going to get abused by her husband, who has absolute control over her in that society, and he could order her to do anything, and he could beat her, do anything he wanted to her. So her point was, her challenge was, what do I do? Do I just bow to an unbeliever, or do I stand up for my faith? And so it was pretty tough for people in that day. And so you wouldn't want to marry, particularly if you're a woman, you wouldn't want to marry a man who was not a believer in that society. And it'd be the same, honestly, I'd say now, this would be one of those that you get a lot of flack if we had people around here that were Muslims. A Christian woman better not marry a Muslim man. Because if that happens, she is really going to make her life's going to be in deep trouble. Because eventually his Muslim faith is going to compel him to convert her to Islam. And if she doesn't, according to the Muslim faith, he can do whatever he wants to her. All right. And so that is very, very serious matter. And that's a more modern parallel to what it would have been like in that day for a Christian woman to be married to a pagan man. All right. So Paul is basically saying here, this is what you do. If your spouse isn't a believer, you don't divorce your spouse. But then it goes on to say, but if they want to divorce you, that's their business. You can't do anything about it. They can divorce you. You don't initiate the divorce, but if they do it, and they leave. And that's just the way it is. God calls us to live in peace. Don't make a big scene about it and all that. You let it happen. It's not the ideal way, but they're not living under God's rules. You are. And so if they want to just leave, they leave. That's what he says. If the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. You're not bound by it, that matter. All right, let me move on to the next one because we're not bound by time so much now because I don't have church right after this. So if I go a little over, I go a little over. Okay, and that's because this is such a long chapter. All right, so then it gets to verse 17, verses 17 through 24, and now he seems to drift away from marriage because now he talks about remaining in the situation that you were in when the Lord called you. And he goes through various situations, about was a man uncircumcised or already circumcised, don't become uncircumcised. Was he uncircumcised, don't be circumcised. Are you a slave? Don't let it bother you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. But otherwise, just stay in the situation that you were in. The thing to note about that is that Paul is pointing out, he says, because he says it 3 times in this section, verses 17, 20, and 24. It says, stay in the situation that the Lord put you in. Now, that's an interesting statement because now it's saying, so the Lord put this person in slavery? Well, in a way, that's it. And he says, but he does say if you can gain your freedom, go ahead and do so. But really what Paul's getting at here, he's saying your relationship with the Lord and the eternal aspect of that relationship is what really matters. Where you are in this life, the situation you are in this life, is just a temporary, fleeting moment. So if you're a slave, you're a slave. And it's maybe a horrible, miserable life. And if you're in a bad marriage, you're in a bad marriage. And it may be a horrible, miserable life. But it's not eternity. It will come to an end. And when it comes to an end and you remain faithful and you retain your faith, of course, the end is forever and ever. And that far surpasses the momentary discomfort or whatever you want to say, aspect of life that you don't want to have. And his main point really is that you need to be living your life for the Lord, and regardless of where he puts you in this life, what situation, social status you are in, or in class status too, whatever it is, don't worry about it. What matters most is your relationship with the Lord. And when you know that, as my notes say, when you know that this world is passing away, and that world, the new heavens and new earth, is eternal and free and perfect, then what are these momentary troubles compared to that? That's what he's saying. So you don't have to be making, or you don't have to be living a life in such a way that you're always thinking, I could have a better life than this. You're going to have a great life for eternity. And so I also put a note, this concept about the grass is always greener on the other side is something Christians need to avoid. And so I say, whether the other side is marriage, or I'm in bad marriage, so I need to get divorced, or whether I'm a slave and so I need to be free, he's saying, no, that's not it. He says, when you find your peace and your contentment in the Lord, then don't worry about those other matters. You're not going to have a great, perfect life. I mean, you can have a great life, but you're not going to have a perfect life here in this world. And it's going to be even worse if you're never content with the relationship you have with God. Be content with that relationship, and these other things won't bother you so much. You'll be able to get through those so much easier, even though they are not the ideal way of having a life. But so be content with the place in life where the Lord puts you, is what he's kind of basically what he's saying there. All right, so let me move on to the next one, though, because we're still barely over halfway. So he says, now about virgins. He says, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. And so again, he says, I have no command from the Lord, and that's because there's no passage that the Lord Jesus has where the Lord Jesus says something specifically about virgins. Now, by the way, it's also important to note that when it says virgins, we probably naturally think of women, and I think the reason why is because of the Virgin Mary. But virgins are, the term applies masculine and feminine. So it's not just for women when you think about virgins. It's also for men as well. And you'll see that also in Revelation chapter 14, it talks about that. So he says, again, he has no specific statement from the Lord on this matter because Jesus has not said anything about it. But what do I have? I got to look at my notes real quick. Oh, yeah, all right. I forgot where I was at here. It says, but I give a judgment, okay? I think it is good for you to remain as you are. Are you unmarried? Do not seek a divorce. Are you married? Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you've not done anything wrong. And if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Okay, that kind of that last point there. I want to spare you this, and he's going to talk about the next statement too, the next section where this world in its present form is passing away. Paul's talking about the situation going on there, and there's two aspects, and this is what I said at the beginning of the class, that there are two aspects that are underlying theme going on here. And he's talking specifically to these Corinthian Christians. And he's talking about, like he says, a present crisis. So what does he mean by a present crisis? Well, historians or archaeologists and historians have discovered that there was a crisis actually going on in Corinth during this time. they said it was during the 40s and the 50s, and that's when Paul was there, and later, right around 50, and he wrote this letter around 52, 54, or something like that. So it was right in that time frame. So he's not just talking about the crisis that you would have as a Christian, specifically as a Christian, in suffering persecution in this world. So there was actually a crisis going on in Corinth at this time, and this is what they discovered, that there were three famines that hit at that time. And the famines were extremely severe. They have writings that they found that they talk about these famines. The famines were very, very severe, so that it was very hard for them to survive. And to get along. So he says, if you're unmarried, he says, don't look for a wife now because you're going to have a lot of problems. Or don't look for a husband now because trying to support a family in the time of a famine is not going to be easy. You're going to, at this time, you're just doing everything you can just to survive on your own. So don't make, he's basically saying, I'm thinking that, I'm looking out for your own good. Because he says that, he says, those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. He's probably not talking about all married people throughout the rest of the time. He's talking about if you get married now, he's saying it's going to be pretty rough for you because you're going to have to try to support your family. And right now, in the present crisis of these famines that are going on in Corinth, that's not going to be an easy thing to do. And he says, you might want to hold off on that. So that's kind of a narrow historical aspect to what he's talking about. There's going to be more to it than that, in what she's going to say in the next section. And so let me get into the next section here. By the way, about the poor and the hungry, you'll hear that. It will come out again in chapter 11. It says it in the notes there too. In chapter 11, when they had their agape meal, that was their communion service, basically. But it was like a potluck that then ended with the Lord's Supper. But he'll talk about in chapter 11 about how when you meet together, some of you go away hungry. Some of you get drunk, and some of you are hungry because some of you are rich and some of you are poor. And some of you are poor, don't even have enough food for a potluck, and the ones who are rich aren't going to share their food with you, which is a sad thing. We'll address that in chapter 11. But he's just acknowledging that there is a situation in Corinth going on where there is a divide here, where some have plenty and some have nothing. And if you have nothing, it's going to be a tough life for you. So that's why he's talking about, in the context of marriage, that it may not be a good thing for you to make a major change in your life at this point. Now, again, that may apply just specifically to those at that time and not to others. But what he does say in verses 29 through 31 does apply to all of us. And this is an interesting section. In fact, I do distinctly remember that this actually becomes one of the scripture readings on our Sunday morning services when we have the readings are on 1 Corinthians. They actually have this as one of the texts. And I preached on it before but it's really, really hard to understand, where he says, what I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. Of course, that's where people make these bad jokes about, you live with married, but I don't want to acknowledge my wife kind of thing. But then the other point is those who mourn as if they did not. I mean, how heartless and cold is that? Someone's mourning, says, oh, don't worry about it, don't mourn. But is that what Paul's saying? And he goes on, that those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something is not theirs to keep, and those who and those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed by them. So what is Paul really getting at here? What he's getting at, he is saying that you need to not be so wrapped up in this world and in any aspect of this world, even the most personal aspect, which is marriage. You don't want to be so tied up into that it distracts you from your faith. And that it would, even worse, like I said earlier about the mixed marriages sometimes, so that it even pulls you away. So that sometimes the unbelieving spouse actually pulls the believing spouse away from God. And they eventually totally disconnect with the church and with God altogether. And he's saying, what you need to know is that your time here is short. your life is not about this life. Your life is really about eternity. You know, well, I'm but a stranger here. Heaven is my home is the idea. So don't get so wrapped up in this life, in any aspect of this life, from the most personal, namely, you know, marriage, all the way to just material things like buying something. So don't be so wrapped up in it that you have to have that, and your life is determined by what you have in this life. And it's really, really sad when you see people see no reason for their life but things and people. When you see that happening, you see what a person is getting to the point that they're starting to devalue their relationship with the Lord and starting to overvalue their material life. And that's just a horrible thing to have happen when that happens. My old thing was when I used to play golf, I'd have, you know, a great golf ball, and I'd end up losing that doggone thing, and just breaks your heart when you lose your favorite golf ball. It's like, it's just a golf ball. It's not a big deal. All right. So I know it sounds petty and all that, but now Paul's saying, he says, take that all the way up to marriage. If you lose your spouse, that is awful because you're tied together. But you have to understand, when you're tied together, two are one, how long is that supposed to last? Until death parts us. What Paul is saying, acknowledging, is that's going to happen. Death will part you. But because of our relationship with Christ, we have something else that we look forward to. And so we're not such that if you lose your family, what do you have to live for anymore? That's not what Paul's saying. Is that our citizenship, he'll say this in Philippians, our citizenship is not here on earth, it's in heaven. And that's what we're looking for. And so, and for a Christian couple, when you lose your spouse, it's not, I mean, you grieve, of course, we'll talk about that in the Thessalonians, but you grieve, but you don't grieve as a person without hope. You know that there's a reunion someday in glory. And so that you're not so tied to this life that this is all there is. There's so much more waiting for us. So that's what he's getting at in that section. And he ends that section by saying this world in its present form is passing away. So why hold on to something that you know is going to be gone pretty soon when you got something that will never fade away ever again? All right. So so hopefully you understand that section there in that light. Okay. Now we got to get to three more sections. He says, I would like to, this next one's a good one. I would like to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of this life, how he can please his wife. And he says the same about a wife. And this is just an obvious point, but this is the point Paul has been building up to. He's saying basically this: our purpose as Christians, and that'd be actually the question to ask if we had it more of our Bible class and we had people who could respond to you. I'd ask it this way: what is our chief purpose in life? Actually, I'm going to drink while you think about it. What is, for us as Christians, what is our chief purpose in life? Exactly. You didn't hear that, but the answer is right. To serve the Lord. Our chief purpose in life is not to have a good home. Now, it's to have a godly home, but not just to have a good home, not to have a good job, not to have whatever the world thinks is important. Our chief purpose in life is to serve the Lord and to devote our life, every aspect of our life, to the Lord. This is what Paul has been doing. So Paul's saying that the easier way to do that is if you're not married. Now, if you're married, don't get divorced so that you can do that, because that was a problem that actually some way misguided pious Christians in church history had done. They divorced their wives. You know, there's a statement that Jesus says, if you really love me, you'd sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and follow me. And people would do that and even divorce their wives and leave them destitute. And Luther just had horrible comments to say about those things. I mean, right comments, but about how horrible that action was. But what he's getting at here says, to serve the Lord without hindrance, the unmarried person can do that far better than the married person. Now, he's not saying marriage is bad. He's not disparaging marriage. He's just saying the way it is in life is that if you truly want to serve the Lord with undivided devotion, and that's what he uses in this term, in the section, undivided devotion, then stay unmarried. If you are unmarried, stay unmarried and devote yourself to the Lord. But if you want to get married, he says, you haven't done anything wrong. He says you haven't sinned if you get married. That's not wrong. Marriage is still always has been and always will be praised and sanctioned by the Lord. But if you want to be fully devoted to the Lord and you're not married, then just stay as I am, Paul's saying. I'm going to stay unmarried, he's saying, so I can give myself fully to the Lord. And I can see then why the Roman Catholics would develop their system of celibacy, as wrong as it is, where they insist upon it. But you can see why they would want their priests and their nuns to remain celibate so they can be fully devoted to the Lord. Okay? But again, please hear this carefully. He is not saying that celibacy is superior to marriage. He's just saying in regard to living your Christian life, it's easier if you're celibate to do that than if you're married, because if you're married, you have concerns that have to be addressed, and they need to be addressed. They must be addressed, and it'd be wrong for you to ignore your family because you're saying, I'm serving the Lord. No, you serve the Lord by serving your family if you have a family. And so don't misread what Paul's saying or what I'm saying here is that if you're married, you are to be the godly husband and wife and godly mother and father that God calls you to be. Okay, so hopefully you understand that, and then he says that at the end there, that section says, I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, meaning not saying that you can't get married. He just says that I want you to be able to live a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So that's what he's saying. And so the idea would be if you are unmarried and if you can get married, that's fine too. But he says, but otherwise, devote yourself fully to the Lord. And that's the greatest life anyone could ever have. And in a married life, devote yourself fully to the Lord. Now, you express that devotion in different ways than an unmarried person expresses that devotion. So that's what he's saying in that section. Hopefully you understood what that means. All right, so moving on to verses 36 through 38. Okay, now this is the final translation problem, and this is kind of a complicated translation problem. There's two translations that you can do, and then I noticed in the NIV here, the footnote in the Concordia Self-Study Bible, in that really small print, and it's really hard to read, there's another alternative way of translating this. And it really is not clear what the translation is supposed to be, although the conclusion ends up basically being the same. But it all goes with, it says, if anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and she's getting along in years and he thinks he should marry her, okay, that's one thing. But the other one, that's one translation. Literally the translation where it says, in the virgin he is engaged to, it really, and the notes will tell you this. If you have the notes, it says, if anyone thinks he is conducting himself improperly toward his virgin, if his passions are strong. It doesn't mean that, he's just, he can't control his sexual drive. It's not saying that at all, but he's just saying if he really thinks he shouldn't marry her, okay, then he should do that, is what he's saying. But the other alternative, it says, if anyone thinks he is conducting himself improperly toward his virgin and she is getting along in years, and if his passions are strong, but if she's getting along in years, which means, as the notes will say, if she's past her prime, beyond marriageable age, or past the bloom of youth. That's another way of translating that. And my fun part, if you had to remember the Beverly Hillbillies, Ellie Mae Clampett was already 15, and she was already an old maid at age 15, according to the Clampetts. Okay, so that was the idea. If someone's already that far along in years, that you should deal with it that way. So he's saying if she's far along in years, if she's an Ellie Mae Clampett, then that's one thing. The third translation is actually found here in the NIV text footnote. talks about now if the father has a daughter that is getting along and he thinks she should get married or not, that's what it's talking about there. All right, so it's kind of a strange thing. But let me just say this: in the broad sense, it really, the notes say it doesn't really matter which translation you adopt. The basic principle applies in either case, and the principle has been the theme, which the underlying theme throughout this is that you need to always be ready for the Lord's return. So if a man feels like he needs to marry, do the right, the noble thing, honorable thing, and marry the virgin because he's engaged to her, not because he got her pregnant, that wouldn't have been acceptable then. But because he's engaged to her, then he should go ahead and do that. But if they can agree that maybe they can devote themselves more fully to the Lord, that they remain in the single or state of celibacy, then he doesn't feel like. He doesn't have to feel like he needs to marry her just because they had been engaged. And they can break off the engagement and just move on in their devotion to the Lord. And that's what Paul is saying. He says, and what it comes down to is that our chief purpose in life still is to remain devoted to the Lord. And how you do that is each person's individual about this, but how you do that is whether you can do it in the state of marriage or where you do it in the state of celibacy or singleness is what you would say too. But again, Paul's saying there's nothing wrong with marriage. There's nothing wrong with marriage. You can get married if you want. He even says that if you get married, the Virgin Mary, she does right, but he does not marry, does even better. And now this is where people will say that Paul is emphasizing celibacy over marriage when he says the person who doesn't get married does even better. That's not meaning that that person is a better, godlier person because they didn't get married. He's just saying that person is back to that point where that person who doesn't get married is doing better in the sense that that person can devote more time and energy and devotion, undivided devotion to the Lord. Not that that person's a godlier person. Celibacy is not to be praised above marriage. They're both there. One's a gift. They're both gifts, actually. Well, but celibacy is a gift that if you can handle that, then you do that. All right, let's finish this off because we're getting way over time now. All right, the last one is it says a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. Okay, in my judgment, he says she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Okay, this is the final statement in this long thing. It says, so this is, what if a widow, basically he's answering the final question that he's going to answer now, is what if a widow wants to remarry? Okay, is that okay for a widow to remarry? Is the question that's asked of him, and he said, sure, it's fine. If she wants to remarry, she can do that, but there's one proviso. He must be a Christian, is what he's saying. And this is that statement. Now, this is about a widow doing it, not about two single people never getting married or before married and looking for a spouse. But the same principle would apply. If you're looking for a spouse, make sure your spouse is a Christian. And he says it's going to make your life so much better if your spouse is a Christian than if your spouse is not a Christian. So that's what he says. And the final point, though, he says, but I think she'd be happier if she just stayed as a widow. And again, it's basically because of the present crisis. She doesn't have to worry about so many other details in this life and what's going on in this life, and she can be more focused on the Lord. And in our book of Acts study, we pointed that out, how, although that was just mainly Jewish people, then widows there, but how the church has benefited and profited so much throughout history from widows who chose not to remarry, but chose to basically be married to the Lord in the sense that they devoted themselves, used that time that they remarried wouldn't be used for their husbands, which is fine, and of course, but they devoted themselves to the Lord and the service of the Lord. And that's what Paul is kind of emphasizing here when he says, I think that they'd be happier. And again, he's thinking about them, but he's not thinking about their loneliness and their being by themselves. He says, I think they'll be happier if they just stay as they are and don't get married. But if they want to, that's okay too. And he says that's his view. Okay, so that was it. That was a long chapter, like I said, 40 verses. It's not the longest chapter in the book of 1 Corinthians. The resurrection chapter, chapter 15, is 50 some verses long. Actually, it's about 60 verses long. Hold it. Oh, okay, never mind. That was a different question. I had a text, but different question. I'll get back to you, Stacy, if you're online. I'll see. I got you. Okay. Are there any questions at the end of this? Otherwise, I'm done with this. Chapter 7. Chapter 8 will be another question that was addressed to Paul, and it has to do with eating food sacrificed to idols. And that will be totally different than this one. It's only 13 verses long, although the notes are a little more than 4 pages, so it'll still take a while because you have to know the background to all that. But next week won't take an hour and 10 minutes like this one has, I hope. Okay? Any questions? Somehow comment if you have a question. If not, hopefully we'll see a lot of you in church tomorrow. For now, let's go ahead and close with prayer. Most blessed Lord, we are grateful for this time you've given us to study your word and for this the practical aspect of this lesson in regard to marriage. We thank you for the gift of marriage. We thank you also for the gift of celibacy that you have given to those to whom you have given it. And we thank you that you have reminded us again that our calling in life as your people is to be in servitude of you and express that service in our devotion to you in the church. And also, if we're in a married state and home and family, that we may give ourselves in devotion to our families and our spouse as we serve them in your name, and that your love may continue to be expressed through our lives in the home as well. And we pray that you'll be with us again as we continue to study this on our own throughout the week, and that you'll guide us and help us to understand more fully what you would have us to know through this. We ask this in the name of your Son, our blessed Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right.
Hey, Pastor.
Oh, good question.
Uh-oh. Yes.
Hey, sorry.